This is Karen de Blasio. I'm on the line here. I'm an HPRP desk officer at HUD, and I want to welcome everybody to the second webinar on determining and documenting HPRP participant eligibility. Thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. I do want to remind everybody that this is a repeat of the webinar that we conducted last week on Monday the 15th. So if you listened into that, you're more than welcome to listen, but there really isn't any new information. This is just a repeat of the webinar that we did on the 15th. And I want to remind everybody as well that we have been typically reaching capacity for these webinars. So if you have staff that weren't able to, or colleagues that weren't able to register for this particular webinar, we will be posting a recording of the webinars, all of them, including this one, on the Homelessness Resource Exchange. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'll just introduce you very quickly to the presenters that will be with you here today. As I said, my name is Karen de Blasio. I'm a HPRP desk officer here in the SNAPS office at HUD. Tom Albanese from Apt Associates will also be presenting with me, and our resource advisor that will be helping us to answer your questions is Christy Greenwald from ICF. So I'll go ahead and very quickly just go over the purpose of today's training or webinar, and really we're here again, this is to talk about determining and documenting participant eligibility for HPRP. So we're really, we would like to provide you with an overview of the requirements and standards for determining eligibility, including application of income and housing status standards, as well as the use of the HPRP Staff Certification of Eligibility for HPRP Assistance, which was previously referred to as the Staff Affidavit. Many of you will know that, already know that a listserv message went out earlier this week. We did change the form slightly, and that includes a new name. So what was formerly known as the Staff Affidavit is now the HPRP Staff Certification, and we'll talk a little bit more about that later on. We have also, in the same listserv message, notification went out that we have issued an update to the income and housing status eligibility determination and documentation standards. That was formerly two different documents that were posted on the Homelessness Resource Exchange. We have combined them into one document, I'm sorry. And the standards have not changed. You won't have to change the way that you're running your program or anything like that. We just combined them into one document for ease in reading and provided a little bit of expanded guidance on a couple of issues that we know grantees have been struggling with as they've been implementing their program. So I just want to make mention that those two things have been updated and are on the HRE. So again, really the purpose today is to talk about determining eligibility and documenting income and housing status for your HPRP clients. So what I'll do now is hand it over to Tom, who's going to discuss a couple of just kind of housekeeping and technical issues about the webinar format and how to answer questions, and then we'll go ahead and get started with the rest of the presentation. So I'll hand it over to you, Tom.
Great, thanks, Karen. Just for folks who are joining us and who registered for the webinar, this is scheduled to last approximately an hour and a half. Karen and I will spend some time walking through materials as we go through. We do want to note that attendees on the webinar today are muted due to the high number of folks we have registered. We have more than 1,000 registered, and as Karen noted, it may turn out that some who registered, since we're limited to 1,000 participants, may not get to participate. If that's the case, if you have staff who are interested in the webinar, who others you may know, this is being recorded and will be available on HUD HRE subsequent to the webinar. We do have some very limited ability to answer questions today as well. However, all questions are very important to us. And we want to strongly advise and encourage folks to use the HUD HRE site as a means for asking questions or trying to obtain responses to questions you may have. There's a great deal of information already posted on the HUD HRE site under the FAQ section, which those are searchable by keyword. Oftentimes, if you have a question, you may find that it's already been answered, and that would be the first route you would want to take. If you cannot find an answer, however, please use the help desk function. There will be some limited ability to submit questions in the course of the webinar. However, again, we're very limited in our ability to answer questions. Christy Greenwald from ICF is standing by and can help to answer any immediate questions, but more often than not, folks will be redirected to the help desk. Also, we have a technical advisor who can assist with any technical difficulties or glitches that folks are experiencing in the course of the webinar related to participation. So that is available to you. If you have a question, you would want to use the question pane that's on the GoToWebinar toolbar that you should see on your screen and have access to. So that would be your mechanism for submitting a question in the course of the webinar. I also want to just note that, as mentioned, the webinar will be recorded and posted to HUDHRE.info. The documents that we referenced today as well, both the staff certification document that Karen just discussed briefly, as well as the updated eligibility documentation or determination and documentation standards publication are found at HUDHRE.info, and we really strongly encourage folks to obtain those documents, to use those as reference. We won't go through every bit of detail in those documents today, but we will be referencing them, and they're available at the HUD-HRE site. Lastly, we do want to note that we will be sending out an evaluation directly to participants based on the email you used when you registered, and we would like to encourage folks to complete the evaluation so we can improve future webinars. Again, if you're just joining us, all attendees are muted, and we have limited ability to answer questions. Please go to the HUD-HRE help desk if you do have a question about eligibility determination and documentation. I'm going to hand it back to Karen now to get into discussion of program assistance types and eligibility requirements.
Okay, thank you, Tom. So I'd like to just kick this morning off just by reviewing something that I'm sure most of you are well aware of at this point. Obviously, there are two types of assistance that can be provided through the HPRP program. And it's really important. I want to just go over it very quickly here because it's important to understand the distinction between these two types of assistance as they're related to the population that's receiving each type of assistance and their housing status at program entry. So as you see on the slide, there's homelessness prevention, which the purpose of this type of assistance is obviously to prevent individuals or families who are at risk of homelessness from becoming homeless. And then we have rapid rehousing, or what we're referring to as homeless assistance in the program. And this is to assist individuals who are experiencing homelessness to be quickly rehoused and stabilized. And in this category, anybody that you serve needs to meet the HUD homeless definition. So moving on, we'll talk a little bit about eligibility requirements. Again, this is probably a review for most of you. As you see on the slide, the three kind of core eligibility requirements that are also listed in the notice. One is an initial consultation. This is required to determine eligibility and also to determine what the most appropriate type of assistance would be for the person or the family. Income, obviously, another eligibility requirement, must be at or below 50% AMI. We'll talk about local determinants in a couple of slides, but most of you know that localities are able to, communities were able to establish a lower bar. You just cannot serve anybody that's above 50% AMI. That's the HUD requirement that's set forth in the notice. Another eligibility requirement is again, looking at housing status. Is the person or household homeless for rapid rehousing assistance, or are they at eminent risk of homelessness for prevention assistance? And when looking at housing status, you also need to look at and be sure that the household or the individual meets both of these following circumstances, that there's no appropriate housing options for them. They're unable to identify, going to stay with a family member or a friend, and the household or participant lacks the financial resources and support networks needed to obtain housing or remain in the housing that they're currently in. And we'll talk a little bit about these. This is essentially what's become known as the but-for rule. And I'll talk a little bit about that in greater detail. But the one thing that I do want to kind of go over here, and I know that there are a lot of people listening that have been challenged, particularly with this but-for rule and documenting housing status and would they be homeless without the HPRP assistance. And one of the things while we're talking about eligibility requirements that I want to be sure to make clear here is that you see on the slide we've listed the eligibility requirements that are set forth in the notice that we've discussed during the regional trainings. We've discussed several, for the past several months, but sustainability of housing is not an eligibility requirement. And I want to make sure that we're clear on that, because we've heard from a lot of different communities across the country that they really seem to be hesitant to serve some people, and they feel that HUD's going to come in and ding them or monitor them and in some way put a mark against them if we see that you're serving somebody who at the end of the day, at the end of the program or at the end of their tenure in the program, they weren't able to move to stable housing. And that's not, while serving folks who probably have a greater chance of becoming stable, while that's the intent of the program, we know that you are going to serve people who, at the end of the day, don't become housed, and that is okay. And we don't want you to be afraid to serve individuals. So we'll talk about it a little bit more, but I wanted to say that up front because I know that's something that's a big issue for folks. And really what we're looking to see when we come in and we look at your programs and we're monitoring, what we're looking to see is that everything's documented. And one of the most frequent monitoring findings in the HUD homeless programs overall, not just HPRP, focuses around eligibility, and it's either that they're serving individuals who truly aren't eligible, so they might be over 50% of the AMI in the instance of HPRP or something like that, or that the documentation is incomplete or missing. And again, we're not looking to see, well, is this person going to be housed at the end of the program? We're looking to see, did they exhaust all their resources? Is there nowhere else for them to go? There's no practical avenue for them to take, and they're going to be homeless, so that's why you serve them. That's all fine. As long as it's documented and we can see that in the case file, we're not going to ding you or tell you that you shouldn't have served somebody because it doesn't look like they'll be housed. So again, we'll talk about that a little bit more, but I just wanted to kind of make that clear at the beginning here. Next slide. As I just mentioned a few minutes ago, talking about local determinants, these previous slides listed our HUD's minimum eligibility criteria, again, as specified in the notice. But we have given grantees a good deal of flexibility with HPRP to develop a program that makes sense in your community. So in addition to these minimum eligibility criteria that we just talked about, we're encouraging communities to consider additional factors when designing your program and when looking and determining a household's level of need for HPRP. The things that we're asking, if you do take advantage of this and use discretion and determine your own local eligibility criteria, obviously they have to fit within the minimum standards, but we're just asking that you have policies and procedures in place to make sure that these criteria are applied consistently. And we will look for that. Again, we're not going to, in most cases we won't come in and question the criteria that you're using. If it's sound and you can really show us how you came to the conclusion that it would make sense to impose additional eligibility criteria, we're looking to make sure that it's clear that, if you're a grantee, that it's clear to all your subgrantees what these additional criteria are and that you have policies and procedures in place. We just need to make sure that it's consistent across all of the grantee and or the subgrantees. So next slide. So another issue that I wanted to touch on briefly is eligibility versus targeting. And while I think eligibility is, as you see on the slide, eligibility is pretty straightforward. It's whether or not the participants who are applying for HPRP assistance, whether or not they meet the minimum requirements. Targeting is slightly different, and this is an area that we've received a lot of questions from communities around implementing HPRP. And it is a bit trickier. It's typically based on factors beyond basic eligibility that allow grantees and subgrantees to identify and serve clients with specific characteristics or risk factors. So there's kind of a circular idea here that the decisions that a community makes around targeting will impact decisions around the type, level of duration or assistance a program offers a participant or a household, and at the same time, program design decisions will impact the target population that is best served by a program. So, for instance, targeting may involve focusing on specific subpopulations, such as young parents. It may involve, if you know that there's a need to, and you have a good deal of homeless families in your community, and you want to target HPRP resources to homeless families, that's fine. As long as they meet the eligibility criteria, it's perfectly fine to do that. Targeting may also involve, again, setting more stringent eligibility criteria than required by HUD for HPRP in order to serve those individuals that are determined to be more at risk of homelessness. So a grantee may decide, for example, to limit eligibility to households at or below 30% of AMI, or serve only those households who will lose housing in the next 7 days. Or they may just strictly stay with the basic HPRP eligibility criteria that requirements set forth in the notice, and decide to provide more intensive and expensive assistance to those households with greater needs. So there's a lot of flexibility and discretion here around HPRP and what you can do in your local community. So the next slide, we'll get into talking about assessment and eligibility certification. So again, grantees and subgrantees must follow HUD requirements related to determining and documenting the housing status and income of individuals screened for assistance. As we mentioned earlier, we did update the income and housing status eligibility and documentation guidelines, and we've also updated the staff certification. Both are available on the HRE. And the staff certification, formerly known as the Staff Affidavit, just to quickly review this, is required for all households determined to be eligible for HPRP assistance. So once you've determined somebody eligible, you need to complete this certification. It essentially documents that the household meets all eligibility criteria for HPRP assistance. It certifies that true and complete information was used to determine eligibility, and that there's no conflict of interest existing between the staff person who's certifying that eligibility and related to the provision of the assistance. So the staff certification must be completed and signed by the person determining eligibility and that person's supervisor for all households who are determined eligible. And the staff affidavit went into effect on November 1st, so you all have been using that form since November 1st. As I said earlier, and Tom said as well, we updated the staff certification. The listserv message did indicate we wanted to allow grantees some time to roll the new form out, so you can continue using the staff affidavit or start using the new certification, but we're asking that grantees have the staff certification form in place by May 1st. So that gives you a little bit of time to kind of roll the form out. Grantees that are listening, it gives you time to get the information out to your subgrantees, make sure that they know they need to switch the forms. And I just want to be clear, you do not need to go back. The staff affidavit forms are still valid. You don't need to go back and take those forms out and put a new staff certification form in. The form didn't change substantively that much. We just received some comments from some communities and took the form back to our attorneys and they suggested some changes based on some community feedback we had. But so I just want to be clear, you don't have to replace the old staff affidavit forms, and you do have until May 1st to kind of roll that form out and make sure that all of your programs are using that form. And so just to reiterate, so it's signed the day or when the person is determined eligible. It's signed by the person who's determining that eligibility and that person's supervisor, and it needs to be completed again at the 3-month certification mark only if a different person is assessing eligibility. If it's the same case manager assessing eligibility and they've already completed a form and their supervisor signed it, then you're fine. No, you don't need to do another staff certification form. It's only if 3 months from now, maybe a different case manager, staff may have turned over. If it's a different person, if it's a different case manager or staff person who's determining eligibility at that 3-month mark or further down the line, then they would need to complete the form, sign it, and have their supervisor sign the form as well. So hopefully that's clear for everybody, and everybody's at least had a chance to look at the new staff certification form. But again, that goes into effect officially on May 1st, so you have some time to get it out to your participants. So the next slide is on eligibility recertification. I touched on this just moments ago when I was talking about having to redo the staff certification. As you know, recertification for HPRP is required every 3 months. Grantees are basically, you need to evaluate and document eligibility for HPRP assistance at least every 3 months, whether it's financial assistance or housing relocation and stabilization services. So we know that many clients will only need a few months of service, and so it's important to be assessing at least every 3 months to confirm how well the program is meeting your client's needs. It may be that the assessment will find that more or different services are needed to assure housing stability. So a little bit here about determining the recertification date, because we have had a couple of questions about exactly how to do that. And the intent of the recertification rule is to ensure programs are fully evaluating households who are receiving ongoing financial assistance to ensure that the household remains eligible and needs continued assistance, particularly since eligibility is based on current income as opposed to past income or projected income. So the application of the rule may vary in different circumstances, but if you're providing ongoing assistance, like therefore consecutive months of assistance, the recertification should be 3 months from the original eligibility assessment date. And that should be done before you either provide or approve an additional or a 4th month of assistance. In contrast, if there's a break in assistance, so a household receives a month of assistance, is determined stable, but 8 months later returns for additional assistance, that household must be reevaluated as if they were going through the initial consultation again. It's not a recertification. It's as if they're actually applying again for assistance because there was a break in service there. So hopefully that's clear. We're going to go ahead now, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about eligibility, particularly for the different program types, rapid rehousing and prevention. And I'll go ahead and start with what I think is probably the easiest. We'll talk about prevention in a couple of slides, but when determining participant eligibility for rapid rehousing, essentially, again, as we said, rapid rehousing is available for persons who are homeless according to HUD's definition. So that means that the participant or the household must meet at least one of the following criteria listed up here on the slide that you see in order to be eligible for rapid rehousing assistance. So they must be sleeping in an emergency shelter. I do want to note that this only includes emergency shelter programs that are identified in the COC's or Continuum of Care's most recent housing inventory chart that was submitted to HUD or otherwise recognized by the COC as part of the Continuum's inventory. So maybe it's a newly established shelter, but it needs to be kind of a recognized emergency shelter. So if they're sleeping in an emergency shelter, sleeping in a place not meant for human habitation, such as a car, an abandoned building, that sort of thing. They've been staying in a hospital or another institution for up to 180 days, but prior to that we're sleeping in an emergency shelter or in places not meant for human habitation. finally, up here on the slide, you see another criteria of this, or another piece of this definition is graduating from or timing out of transitional housing. It's important to note you can't use HPRP funds to place somebody into transitional housing, but you can use them. You can use HPRP to assist somebody who is in transitional housing and must go and would be homeless when they leave their transitional program. And then finally, victims of domestic violence as well. So you could go on to the next slide. So now we'll talk a little bit more about homelessness prevention, which this is a little bit trickier than just kind of the definition for rapid rehousing. And, you know, as I just went over, I think the HUD's definition of homelessness is pretty well understood. But it can be more challenging to identify people who are housed but have a very high risk of becoming homeless. There are many people who are housed and have a great need, but truly they would not become homeless if they did not receive assistance. So we're strongly encouraging grantees and subgrantees to target this prevention assistance to households at the greatest risk of becoming homeless. So to be eligible for HPRP-funded prevention assistance, grantees and subgrantees must assess and document that the household would become homeless but for the HPRP assistance. And I talked a little bit before about the but-for rule. That is, would this individual or family be homeless but for this assistance? Do they lack any other place to stay? They lack the support networks. They lack financial resources. Would they be homeless but for this assistance? Households applying for HPRP assistance must take place in an initial consultation and eligibility screening. They must provide information on their income, and they must either be homeless or at risk of becoming homeless without HPRP assistance. These three criteria, again, are relatively easy to assess and document, but for prevention, there's a bit more to the assessment process. So in addition to assessing and documenting income and the current housing situation, grantees and subgrantees must also assess whether the household would become homeless without the assistance, as I said. So this really requires you to work, your grantees and subgrantees and your case managers, it really requires you to work with participants to assess and document, and that's the key, that the additional three circumstances that we just talked about earlier are met. It's critical, and it also is subjective, and we recognize that, and that's why I said earlier, we're really not going to, you know, we're not going to come in and question a case manager's judgment. You know, these funds are limited, and we want to ensure that they can be as effective as possible, and we can help to serve the most people as possible. So we need to make sure that you're asking the right questions and that your case managers are really doing their best to assess that an individual or a household would be homeless but for the assistance. But again, we're not going to question that judgment. We've had several questions, and a lot of people, when I go to different trainings, stop me and ask me, well, is there a form that we need to fill out, or what do we have to have in our case file that you'll look at and you can see that we've asked the right questions, or we did document that they would be homeless but for. They didn't have the resources to secure additional housing or stable housing. And there is no one thing. There are plenty of grantees out there that have created tools, that have checklists, things like that their case managers are using, and that's fine. But as long as it's documented somewhere in the file, and it can simply be documented in the case manager's case notes. If the case manager has a conversation with the person and asks the right questions and documents in their case notes that, yes, they have family in the area, but they've been staying with them, or they've stayed with them and they can't go back there, whatever the reason is, as long as that's documented in the case notes, that's okay. We're not looking for anything more than that, and there definitely isn't a form or anything that you have to fill out and put in the case file. It just needs to be documented in some way. So I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about prevention, and these are just some possible living situations that some participants coming to you applying for HPRP that may apply to them. So they could be in a situation where they're renting a house or an apartment where they're living right now. They could be doubled up with family or friends. They could be in a hospital or institution. They could be in hotels or motels not paid for by federal or state government or charitable programs. One thing that I want to talk a little bit about here, because again we've had a lot of questions about households who are at risk of losing housing due to utility non-payment. So again, they would fall under the prevention. They're not homeless because they're currently housed. It's not stable, and the reason that it's not stable is because of utility non-payment. And we have had quite a few questions, and there's actually a frequently asked question, or an FAQ, that you'll hear us talk about often. There's an FAQ on utility-only assistance. And essentially, folks are asking, well, how do we document this, and can we provide just utility-only assistance? We do expect that it will probably be rare. We know that in many states and localities there are laws that prevent companies from shutting off power during winter months, for example, things like that. There are also laws that require utility companies to offer payment plans to households that miss payments. So, we know that there are other kind of stopgap measures that are in place to prevent somebody from becoming homeless because of a missed utility or payment or several missed utility payments. So you need to make sure that that's not available to a client that's presenting, and that for utility-only assistance. You also need to make sure that no other utility assistance, such as LIHEAP, is available to prevent the shutoff. And we've had a lot of questions about that, but it's really very important to make sure that there's no other local programs that the individual or the household could apply for. So if neither of the conditions exist, meaning there's no local laws that say that the power is not going to be turned off, or there's no other funding stream they can go to, then utility-only assistance can be provided. There are a couple of different scenarios. One is if utility is going to be shut off during winter months, and it would literally be a dangerous living situation for the occupants. If they're going to have to abandon the housing due to lack of utilities, and by having utilities made would avoid moving into a shelter. In another scenario, an applicant's lease may include a provision requiring utilities be maintained for the unit by the tenant. So as a result, a utility shutoff could constitute a lease violation, which would then place the household at risk for eviction. So these are some scenarios that you need to look at, and you need to make sure that a family or a household applying for utility-only assistance meets. I'm going to go ahead and go to the next slide so we can try to stay on schedule here. The next slide is about participant eligibility. This is where we start to get into income. Again, we've gone over quite a bit what the requirements or the eligibility requirements around income are. The HPRP notice sets forth that the household or person applying for assistance must be shown to be at or below 50% area median income. This needs to be documented in their client file, in their case file. As I mentioned earlier, if a community chooses to set a parameter lower than 50%, that is fine. You just need to make sure that you're not serving anybody that is over 50% area median income. AMIs are based on state and local communities and jurisdictions in which the household resides, and it's dependent on the size of the household, like the number of household members and that sort of thing. And you can find the AMI for your state and your community at the HUDuser.org, and the website is up here, but you can find the information on the HRE as well, where to find your AMI. And I would like everybody to note that the data set does change annually, and it is updated on HUD User, so we just encourage grantees to go and check it every couple months just to make sure that they're using the most recent AMI for their community. So the next bullet on the slide you'll see is the income definition. And essentially, there are a couple of components to the definition of income for HPRP. First, gross income, and that's the amount of income that's earned before any deduction, such as health care, taxes, anything like that are made. The next, and you can go to the next slide, the next kind of piece of income is that we're looking at is current income, and that's income that the household is currently receiving at the time of application for the assistance. And again, income, that's what we're looking at. The day they present, they could have been laid off 2 days prior. We're not looking at that income. This is income the day that they're presenting that they're applying for assistance. So income from recently terminated households should not be included. You want to make sure that when you're calculating current income at the 3-month eligibility recertification point that we just talked about, that you're also basing the total income on what they're receiving at the time of recertification, not projected income in the future, not previous income. It's at the time of recertification. And there's more additional information in the document, the guidance document that was just updated that's posted on the HRA. So next slide. So another kind of piece of determining income and looking at income is we've listed, and again this is in the document, the guidance document as well, we've listed several different inclusions and types of income to be counted, and exclusions, types of income that should not be considered for all adult members of a household. So for example, something like assets. Assets generally not counted, would not be counted except interest and dividend income. And in a couple of slides, I'll talk a little bit more about assets. But you can go to the next slide, and that actually lists some of the items that are on the income inclusions list. So when we talk about determining or calculating income for HPRP eligibility purposes, you want to look at earned income that somebody's earned through employment, self-employment or business income, interest and dividend income, pension or retirement income, TANF, public assistance income, any unemployment income that they may receive, unemployment benefits, alimony, child support, foster care income, and then you'll see up there armed forces income. The next slide lists, and it's a slightly longer list, lists the exclusions. And this list is more detailed in the document that I've been referring to that's on the HRE, and the list actually that's in the document actually has a pretty good explanation of each of these incomes, inclusions and exclusions. But some of the things that you need to exclude when you're calculating income for eligibility purposes for HPRP are things like income of children, income of disabled persons, student financial aid, any sort of, we have listed up here other income, anything that's temporary, that's sporadic, that's not recurring, that's really not a dependable source of income. So again, we encourage you to look at the document that's on the HRE when looking at determining your income and looking at inclusions and exclusions. So on the next slide, we're still talking about income and determining eligibility here. This, we're looking a little bit at just once you've kind of figured out what you're going to count, what's included and what's excluded, we're looking at calculating income. So you essentially want to annualize based on the current documented gross income for the household. So it's like the example that's given up here. $525 gross wages for the most recent 2-week pay period. Multiply that by, in this case, 26 pay periods, and that gives you $13,650 annual income. That's pretty straightforward. If you're calculating income based on hourly or weekly or monthly payment information, this is where it might get a little bit trickier. You want to add the gross amount earned in each payment period that is documented and divide by the number of payment periods. So this will give you an average wage per payment period, and then if you know, if the person's able to tell you how many payment periods there are, you can multiply that and get an annualized wage. Again, documentation is the key here. You really kind of need to put on a kind of a third-party hat and be able to look at a case file and see that if you're not the case manager or the project manager at the project and you open the case file, is somebody able to look and see what the AMI is for that area, what this person's gross income is or that household's gross income is relative to the AMI? What sources of income were included? Was there anything that was excluded? You really need to be able to see all of this in the case file for us to ensure that that the income calculation was done properly and that the person or the household really is eligible for HPRP assistance. So we do have a sample income calculation worksheet that is also on the Homelessness Resource Exchange, the HUD HRE. So I encourage grantees or subgrantees who have not seen that to take a look at that because that's helpful as well. It's not a required form, but it's a tool that you can use to help you calculate income. So the last slide that I want to go to, and the last little bit before I hand it over to Tom about on income is, again, I spoke a little bit earlier about treatment of assets, and I said we'd talk a little bit more about that. And I just want to, touch on that here. There was a lot of discussion early on in HPRP about treatment of assets and, what was counted and what shouldn't be counted. And essentially, assets are cash or material items that can be converted to cash quickly. So we're talking about things like amounts of money that are in checking or savings accounts, bank accounts, stocks, bonds, money market funds, any other type of investment account, cash value of a trust that maybe is something, is in a household member's name that can be withdrawn by that household member, IRAs, things like that, any sort of inheritance, capital gains, lottery winnings, things like these. So these are assets. These are what we're talking about when we're talking about assets. And like I said, there's been a lot of back and forth about this, and there was a lot of discussion early on in the program as people were setting up their program, and the question was, well, can I tell somebody that they have to spend down to a certain amount, or if they have money in a checking account that we can't help them, and that sort of thing? And really the answer is HUD, we haven't established requirements for how assets are to be treated when determining whether a household has the resources to address their housing need, nor have we established a requirement that if there's a certain amount or if any amount of the assets needs to be spent down, if you will. So if you have somebody with a $10,000, bank account, there's no HUD requirement that they must spend that money down. We're requiring grantees to determine whether at the grantee level, whether an applicant household must spend down its assets, and if so, by how much, for the purposes of determining eligibility and the type and level of assistance that household may require. So grantees may establish a separate policy for each local continuum of care. This might pertain particularly to like a state-level grantee who has several different continuums of care operating. You can defer if they already have a policy in place. That's fine. You may want to establish a separate policy for each COC. Again, consistency is the key here. We just want to make sure that whatever kind of policy around assets and spending down of assets that you adopt, that it's adopted and it's clear to everybody and it's being done in a consistent and uniform way across all of the subgrantees, whether it's within a continuum of care or a larger area. So again, and there's a little bit more of a discussion on assets in the updated income and housing status documentation guidance that's on the HRE. So what I'd like to do right now, I've gone over quite a bit of the determining eligibility, sorry. I've gone over determining eligibility in great length, and what I'd like to do now is hand it over to Tom, and he can walk you through some of the standards that we've set forth on how now to document that eligibility once you've determined that somebody is eligible. So Tom, I'll hand it over to you.
Great, thanks, Karen. I do want to note, I saw a question come in about the income calculation worksheet, and I want to apologize. I didn't want to interrupt Karen earlier, but the income calculation worksheet is being updated, and it will be reposted to HUD HRE within the next week or so. But in the meantime, as Karen mentioned, documenting income calculations and comparisons to the area median income can be done by any number of means. It just simply needs to be sort of clearly indicated in the file what the household income is on an annual basis and how that compares to the area median income for that household size. So if someone were to review the file, they could easily see the eligibility standard was met. I'm going to talk next about some documentation standards. These are all explicitly kind of laid out in the updated income and housing status determination and documentation standards guidance that Karen referenced and as now is posted at HUD HRE. But we did want to spend some time today talking about those standards and just clarifying some points regarding them. First of all, we want to stress that it really is the responsibility of each grantee and subgrantee to ensure that appropriate and complete documentation is included in each participant's case file. Ultimately, if there is a monitoring that occurs or if a grantee comes to monitor a subgrantee, they would want to be sure that in reviewing a particular household case file, that evidence of eligibility is clearly documented. And what I'm going to walk through are standards around documentation that our grantees and subgrantees are advised to follow to ensure that documentation is clearly established. For purposes of HPRP, HUD allows various types of documentation. And these are outlined in the publication we've been referencing in terms of preference. And ultimately, it's always preferable to first obtain or try to obtain third-party verification and documentation. But there are different other allowable types of documentation if third-party documentation can't be obtained. And basically, it's in order of preference. Written third party is the first order of preference. If that can't be obtained, then oral third party. And lastly, and only in some cases, would applicant self-declaration be acceptable? And I'll talk about those in the next set of slides. But written third-party documentation might be something like a pay stubs indicating the wage earned by a household. It might be a letter or other written verification from a shelter provider indicating that the household is a current shelter resident. Something like that would constitute a written third-party verification. Oral third-party verification is still confirmation from a third party, whether it be the income source or the shelter provider or the street outreach worker verifying the housing status. Some third-party verification obtained via oral means, which might be a phone call or a face-to-face conversation with that third party to the with the HPRP staff member verifying the information. And that would have to subsequently be documented by the HPRP staff person that a phone conversation was held on such and such date, documenting the information that's provided. Lastly, applicant self-declaration is just exactly what it indicates. It's an affidavit or verification from the applicant themselves as to their income or housing status. And we'll talk in a moment about when it might be appropriate or acceptable to obtain that. But before we get into specifics of housing and income status documentation and what types of documentation are acceptable, we should talk first about how the process that grantees and subgrantees should go through in thinking about what an acceptable level of documentation is. And basically, there's a couple different variables to consider when thinking about appropriate levels of documentation. It's expected that grantees and subgrantees will make every effort to achieve the highest standard that's reasonable given their means, their program means and resources, as well as the type of assistance and the circumstances that present in a given case. So examples of that are that it may be that if a program is providing only one-time assistance for households and there's no ongoing assistance provided, and all the target population are those who are households who are not only meet the but-for test but have other very critical needs and are really in the most critical or dire situations where immediate assistance is typically required, then the documentation necessitated might be such that obtaining third-party verification in all cases isn't feasible. That in fact the crisis might occur if there's a delay while waiting for third-party documentation. But those situations might be a case for case. Ultimately, it does depend on the type of service provided. For example, some income documentation requirements for one-time assistance may not be reasonable if, again, if a household is going to become literally homeless while third-party documentation is obtained. So if an employer, for example, isn't able to, or if a person doesn't have their current pay stubs, or they are, an employer is unwilling to provide a written letter, then perhaps a phone call to the employer would be the most reasonable alternative in that case, because it would be the time delay to obtain written verification would be such that literal homelessness would occur in the interim. It may be, however, that if medium-term rental assistance is being provided, or ongoing rental assistance for 2 or more months, then perhaps a higher standard is more reasonable to obtain. So it could be expected that if there's ongoing engagement and services provided to a household, that it's more reasonable to expect that one could obtain third-party documentation for the case file. In all cases, the HPRP grantee or subgrantee must provide a brief written description of efforts to obtain third-party documentation in the case file. If a lower standard is used for whatever reason, then the subgrantee or the grantee must document, the staff member must document in the case file why, and the general kind of circumstances why the lower standard was used. It doesn't have to be anything exhaustive, but a brief description in a case note or on the assessment form or on the documentation form would suffice. I want to make a special note just about self-declaration of housing status. And this is acceptable really in only very limited circumstances. Self-declaration of housing status is HUD recognizes there may be some unusual cases where it's just simply not feasible or possible to obtain third-party verification of when a household is at risk of losing housing. This might be instances where a household is doubled up, and given the nature of their relationship with their host family or friend, that host family or friend is just simply unwilling to provide any verification that they're being asked to leave or what have you. But given the assessment with the applicant and given their own declaration of what the housing status is, it may be in that case that their declaration is sufficient to verify the nature of the housing situation, the fact that they're at risk of losing that housing if assistance through the HPRP program is not provided. But again, in that case, it must be clearly documented in the case file why other third-party verification could not be obtained. Next, I want to talk just briefly about timeliness, and specifically timeliness of income documentation. And this is a question that comes up often in terms of how far back does a program have to go to document, or what's considered current documentation of income. Generally, per the guidance issued by HUD, documentation should be dated within the prior 30 days for income. So it should be a recent pay stub, a recent, a letter from an employer that's dated within the last 30 days. Some, income verification that's dated within the last 30 days. Identifying the current income is generally what's acceptable for purposes of documenting income. However, it should be noted that for public assistance benefits, HUD recognizes that there may only be periodic issuances of a benefit statement or some documentation from the public assistance administrator. And in that case, the most recent benefit statement that was received within the past 12 months would be an acceptable documentation of that benefit, so long as it reflects current benefits received by the applicant household. Also, it would be acceptable to show a copy of a recent bank statement that indicates a direct deposit of the benefit as another means of documenting benefit receipt and current income. Next, I'd like to move into the documentation standards related to housing status, and pointing out again that these are listed by, when I'm talking about housing status, we're going to move through these in kind of two blocks. One is for persons who are homeless. That would be persons who may qualify for rapid rehousing assistance, who have a homeless status at entry of literally homeless per the data collection guidelines. And then later I'll talk about persons who are at risk of homeless, those who are applying for homelessness prevention assistance, who have a housing status of something other than being literally homeless. And I'll talk about these per each of the eligible categories that Karen talked through earlier in our presentation. And within each of these statuses, for the first one being emergency shelter, these are listed in order of preference. And again, I'm not going to go through the detail of each of these types of documentation and the type of information that should be included in them. That's all specified in the Income and Housing Status Determination and Documentation Standards publication that's up on HUD HRE, but I will briefly review them. But these are all listed in order of preference. So when we think about emergency shelter, if I'm an HPRP program and I have a household who I'd like to assist with rapid rehousing, and they're staying at an emergency shelter, the first order of preference, the first type of documentation I should attempt to obtain or see if I can obtain is some record from the local homeless management information system that verifies that the person is a present resident of that emergency shelter, that shows a shelter record of their current residency with a program entry date and presumably no program exit date because they're a current occupant of that shelter. That would be some printout from HMIS that demonstrates that I copy to my file would be the most preferred form of documentation. If I can't obtain that, then the next preferred form of documentation would be a homeless certification. And basically, a homeless certification is a standardized form that allows an HPRP program to obtain all required information or information that would document homeless status from an emergency shelter in a consistent manner. It's basically, the way to think about it is it's a standardized form that would be used for any shelter provider or homeless outreach provider, and we'll talk about that next. And it allows that provider to basically fill in the blanks and verify that the person applying for rapid rehousing assistance is in fact one of their shelter residents. If that can't be, if neither type of documentation can be obtained for a shelter resident, then lastly, a letter from the shelter provider on their letterhead documenting that the person is a current resident would be acceptable. In no case, however, for emergency shelter is self-declaration acceptable as a means of documentation. So it's expected, HUD expects that in every case, somebody who's in a shelter should be able to, or documentation from that shelter provider should be able to be obtained and kept in the file to document the shelter status of that household, that applicant household. In contrast, for persons who are living outdoors, who are currently homeless without any shelter, who are in a place not meant for human habitation, sleeping in a car, under a bridge, in an abandoned building, the first means of documentation that a program should attempt to secure is a homeless certification. If that can't be obtained, then a letter from the street outreach provider would be acceptable. But it's also, HUD also recognizes that in many cases, folks, particularly persons who are not sheltered, who are living outdoors for whatever reason, may not be engaged with anyone. There may not be any third party who could verify that. And in that case, then a self-declaration of the homelessness of that person would be acceptable for the file. The next category are persons who are in a hospital or other institution. And this gets a little more complicated if you are serving somebody who is exiting a hospital or other institution. There's really sort of two types of documentation that have to be obtained. One is simply verification from that hospital or institution that the person is in fact being discharged and when they're being discharged. And then secondly, you would need to document that prior to entering the institution and within that 180-day window, they were in a situation where they were in a shelter or living on the street immediately prior to entering the institution. And so those standards related, so really there's two types of documentation. One is just that they're a resident of the hospital or institution, and then secondly that they were in a shelter or on the street prior to. And the documentation for the shelter or prior street home situation would be identical to if a person was currently in a shelter or on the street. And so those documentation standards would apply for the prior situation before going into a hospital or institution. For somebody who is graduating from or leaving or timing out of transitional housing, either a homeless certification or a letter from the transitional housing provider is acceptable. Those are the only two acceptable types of documentation per the standards. And then lastly, for somebody who's leaving a domestic violence situation, self-declaration is acceptable. Next, I want to talk about persons who are at risk of homelessness. And these would be persons who are applying for prevention assistance. And again, this goes by sort of the living situation of an applicant at time of application. And there's, as we all know, there's various situations that people may find themselves in when they're at risk of homelessness. And I just want to quickly walk through these. But I do want to point out, as we move into this, that no single piece of documentation, such as a utility shut-off notice or an eviction notice alone, is sufficient on its own to demonstrate eligibility. And I think we've heard lots of cases, I'm sure Karen and others at the staff's office would agree, where grantees or subgrantees are simply only obtaining, say, an eviction notice as documentation that a household meets the eligibility criteria, when in fact it also needs to be demonstrated that the person has no other housing options, no other financial resources or support networks, and they're at imminent risk. And we'll talk about that in a moment. But so as we talk about documenting these at-risk situations, just keep in mind that there is still additional documentation necessary to obtain to document the but-for provisions of HPRP, and we'll hold on that for a moment. So for persons who are currently renters, there might be various situations either that put them at risk, either a non-payment of rent or some other lease violation, or perhaps there's a utility non-payment. In either case, some copy of the lease and or a written occupancy agreement verifying that the person is in fact the legal tenant has to be obtained. But then further, if a person is being placed at risk of eviction because of non-payment, some form of eviction notice, confirmation from the landlord or owner that the person is in fact going to be evicted if rental arrears or rent is not paid needs to be obtained. It might also be that the person's already, the eviction action's already been filed with the court, and so some court order or court documentation would be acceptable. One or the other types of third-party documentation would be acceptable. As Karen mentioned earlier, if a household's at risk of losing their housing because of utility non-payment, there is, it's important to note that HUD expects that those would be, really not frequent or infrequent situations where utility-only assistance is provided through HPRP. It's expected that households who are eligible for HPRP will, in fact, probably need more than just utility assistance to maintain their housing if they're at risk. If they're not paying their utilities, it's quite likely that they haven't already also paid rent. In any case, however, if they're at risk of having a utility shut off, then it also not only must a utility shut-off notice be obtained, some documentation from the utility provider that utility will be shut off, but it also needs to be documented that the household is either going to be placed at risk of losing their housing with the utility shut off because the housing is uninhabitable and is not a safe place to live because if the utility shut off, or that they have an obligation to keep the utility on per their lease requirement, and if the utility is shut off, they will in fact be evicted. And that needs to be documented in the case file. It could be that a letter from the landlord would suffice. It could be that a copy of the lease highlighting the utility obligation would suffice. In any event, it just needs to be clearly demonstrated that the household will lose their housing if the utility is shut off. There are also situations where a renter or other housing that's occupied by the applicant is going to be lost because that housing is being foreclosed on. Oftentimes, particularly nowadays, rental housing is being foreclosed on. Owners are not able to maintain their mortgages and are having to, in turn, evict their tenants. In that case, some notice that the building is being foreclosed on would be needed, as well as, again, verification that the renter is, in fact, a legal tenant in the building. In situations where there's other housing that's occupied by the applicant, and that would be where a person is living doubled up with family or friends, then some letter or verification from that host family or friend is preferred and should be obtained, if at all possible, verifying that the person has to leave or is being asked to leave, as well as verification that the host family or friend is, in fact, the legal tenant of that unit. And then only in certain situations would self-declaration be acceptable, per what we discussed previously, when there's just simply no ability to obtain documentation from that host family or friend. There may be situations as well where housing is simply uninhabitable. The housing's been condemned. There's some public official or code enforcement or child welfare or other government entity that's determined that this housing is unfit for habitation. In that case, some documentation from that third party would suffice, as well as, again, documentation that the person is the legal tenant. There are also some limited situations where a person or a household who is currently a homeowner may be eligible for HPRP assistance if they're losing their housing. And again, without HPRP assistance, they are going to become literally homeless. I want to emphasize that HPRP cannot be used for mortgage assistance to pay for mortgage or insurance related costs to home ownership. However, that doesn't mean that homeowners are excluded from receiving HPRP assistance. They could, in fact, receive HPRP assistance to relocate to rental housing or to assist with a utility payment, but they cannot. You cannot use HPRP assistance to pay for a mortgage or an insurance payment for that house. And there are lots of, in most communities, many other resources to assist homeowners with mortgage payments or to negotiate with the lender. Lots of HUD housing counseling agencies in many communities can assist with that. We would encourage folks to link applicant households to those resources. For persons who are being discharged from a hospital or other institution who have been there for more than 180 days and have not previously been homeless, some statement from that hospital or institution would be needed. And then lastly, for persons who are in a hotel or motel that is not paid for by federal, state, or local government or charities, in other words, if they're not in a hotel or motel by virtue of a voucher being paid for by third parties, their own resources that's paying for it, then a self-declaration would be an acceptable type of documentation. And here again, the household has to be literally sort of at the end of their resources. They're at risk of losing all housing, even temporary housing that they're paying for out of their own pocket by virtue of a hotel or motel, because they're now out of resources and they have no other assistance to tap into. We have a quick polling question that we want to ask, and just to get a very quick sort of a gauge of where folks are at in their understanding. And Angela, could you cue this up for us, please? Or maybe not. Okay. So the question is an eviction notice alone enough to qualify someone to receive HPRP assistance? And if folks can just take a moment and answer the question, we'd like to see just how much is understood here in terms of requirements, and then we'll see where we're at. Okay, let's go ahead and close the poll. And it looks like the vast majority, 96% of folks, are answering no, which is correct, and that's good news. It's a pretty straightforward question, but it seems to, at least early on, have caught some folks up. So I'm glad to hear that. Moving on, I want to talk just briefly about the housing status documentation standards, and as related to other subsequent housing options and financial resources and support networks. As Karen mentioned, there is no set type of documentation for this. However, it's expected that grantees and subgrantees will assess and document whether or not a household applying for assistance has other housing options and whether or not they have other financial resources or support networks to obtain or maintain housing. Ultimately, this may be documented by virtue of an assessment form or case notes or some other file documentation that clearly indicates that the household has no other housing options, no financial resources, and no support networks to address their housing needs. This is something that also for financial resources, it's important to note that it may be that there's other assistance programs in the community that could possibly help a household. But the important thing to keep in mind is, as we mentioned earlier, if it's not reasonable to expect that household to go and apply for that assistance and receive it in time to address the need, then it may not be considered a financial resource available to that household. We have heard of some communities where households are being required to go and apply for other assistance that may take, 7 days to 10 days to 2 weeks to receive word on or to be considered for. And in the intervening period, the household may, in fact, be at risk of losing their housing. If that's the case, then it's not reasonable to expect that household to go and apply for that financial assistance resource, and it should be documented in the file that that financial assistance resource, given the circumstance, is in fact not available to the household in a timely fashion sufficient to meet the need. That would be a reasonable standard to apply, so long as, again, it's clearly indicated in the case file that that financial resource is not truly accessible in time to address the need. I want to make a very quick note about housing status for folks who are participants of an HPRP program. Basically, housing status, as I mentioned earlier, is one of 4 categories per the data collection standards. Literally homeless, at imminent risk of losing housing, at risk of losing housing, which is simply not at imminent risk, or stably housed. Persons who are assisted with HPRP maintain that housing status after they enter the program. So for purposes of eligibility for other programs, that housing status that they had upon entry is maintained until they exit the program. So if they were homeless just prior to HPRP, they continue to be considered homeless even while receiving HPRP assistance, just like a person in transitional housing is continued to be considered homeless. I want to talk briefly about income documentation standards. Again, I'm not going to go through this in detail. It's all specified in the publication on the HUD HRE. But I want to talk about these basically in 3 categories of documentation, either written verification from a third party, oral verification, or self-declaration. And for written verification, there's some examples we show here in terms of what might suffice for written verification. So pay stubs would be an example, benefit statement or notice, a court order indicating child support, for example, a tax return if there's a business income involved, a dividend interest statement, or other written verification. In all cases, written verification of income should, indicate the income source, the applicant name, who the recipient is, the amount and frequency, and some contact information for that income source. In most cases, if it's something other than like a benefit statement or a pay stub, if it's other written verification of income that a program seeks to obtain from the income source, you would want to make sure that's signed and dated by the income source representative. There are written verification of income templates available on the HUD HRE, just as there are housing status verification templates. These are not required by HUD, these templates. They can be adopted by programs and used as they are, and those would be easy things to do for programs, or they can be adapted by HPRP programs and put into use, but they are not required by HUD. They're merely examples of the types of third-party documentation that can be obtained. For oral verification, this would be, again, there's an example of a form that can be used to obtain oral income verification. You would want to assure that it has, basic information on that income source, the amount and frequency, contact information, and then ultimately the HPRP staff who obtain the oral verification would want to sign and date that. And then lastly, only if oral verification or written verification cannot be obtained would self-declaration be acceptable. We have our next and our last polling question. So if we can open up our last poll here. And the question is third-party documentation okay when no written verification is available and assistance is needed now to prevent homelessness? So a third-party, actually it should say third-party oral verification okay. So is it okay for me to pick up the phone and call an employer and verify that this applicant household is in fact employed and the amount that they received and the information for the case file when they don't have a pay stub and they're going to be lose their housing imminently without assistance from my program? And if we can close the poll, I see that 97%, 96% answered yes, that is correct. That would be acceptable to accept a lesser preferred type of documentation, in this case oral verification, if written verification can't be obtained in a timely fashion. Now I'm going to hand it back over to Karen, who's going to take us through the rest of our presentation.
Thanks, Tom. So really what I'd like to do is just spend another minute or two just wrapping up. I know that we've gone over a lot of information today for everybody, and again, just to reiterate, the webinars are being recorded, and the slides and the recordings of the webinars will be available on the Homelessness Resource Exchange. The address for that is on the slide, or on the slide that you see right now, www.hudhre.info/HPRP. Also on the HRE, there are a couple of different tabs. If you go underneath and click on Homelessness Prevention, the HPRP program, you'll see that there's a tab with HUD-issued guidance. This contains all the official HUD guidance and information related to HPRP, so the program notice, eligibility, determination, and documentation requirements, grantee contact info, different things. There's a tab for data collection and reporting. This contains guidance and tools related to the different systems that we use to collect data, eSNAPs, federalreporting.gov, HMIS, things like that. There's a tab called Tools and Templates, and this contains technical assistance resources and sample tools that might be helpful to grantees or subgrantees as they're implementing and running their programs. It is important to note that the resources under that tab are examples. They're not required. And finally, there's a tab. I saw a couple questions earlier. People were asking, Tom and I both mentioned FAQs, and people were asking where to go to find the FAQs. Under the FAQ and Help Desk tab, under HPRP on the HRE, there's a searchable database of the frequently asked questions, and that's updated. We're trying to update it quarterly. And there's also the virtual help desk. So the virtual help desk is where you can go, as most of you I'm sure probably know, where you can go and ask a question, and it's submitted to the help desk, and then you get a response through the help desk. We do ask that while that option obviously is available to you, we ask that before you submit a question on the help desk that you look through the FAQs and look through the guidance that's already on the HRE just to make sure that the answer isn't already there. We cannot make an eligibility determination for you through the help desk, and we get a lot of questions like that. We also get a lot of questions where we essentially just have to refer people back to the FAQs. And as many of you probably know, some of the help desk questions, it does take us a little while to respond to. And so we're trying to encourage people to look at the FAQs and see if they can come up with an answer in the FAQs, because the more questions we get on the help desk, the longer it takes us to go through them and answer them. On the next slide is just an announcement or kind of a reminder for our the HUD upcoming conference on homelessness. We're holding two conferences. One will be in Denver and one will be in Atlanta. The dates are up on your screen. The Denver conference is September 14th through 17th, and the Atlanta conference is September 27th through 30th. These are not just HPRP meetings. These will we will cover topics. We will cover some HPRP information, but we will also cover HARS and HMIS as well. The next slide really just reiterates, if you do have questions, go to the help desk. Again, www.hudhre.info. I will also, because I haven't mentioned it yet on this training, I will also encourage anybody who is not on the HPRP listserv to please go to the HRE and sign up for the HPRP listserv. That is our primary method of communication to grantees and subgrantees. Anybody can join. And again, that is our primary way that we get the word out if we have a policy update or we have some information around reporting deadlines or anything like that. And finally, the last slide I think has some additional trainings. And as you know, we've gone through several webinars this month. We will have a new set of webinars, and you'll receive a listserv message about those probably within the next couple of weeks. We will have some additional webinars on new topics coming in the months ahead. So far we have left, we're getting down to the end of what we have in March. We have, I guess the last one is just Wednesday next week at 11 a.m. on reporting. We had a reporting webinar this past Tuesday, which is up there, and then we also will repeat that reporting webinar on Wednesday the 31st at 11 a.m. next week. So we encourage you, if you weren't able to get into the first one, again, it is just a repeat, go ahead and try to register for the second reporting webinar, and look for your listserv message to let you know what we'll have upcoming in April. So we're actually right at our time. It's 12:29 by my clock. I want to thank everybody. I want to thank Christy from ICF, and Angela, who did logistics, and Christy that did the questions, and Tom for presenting with me. We obviously couldn't do these webinars without them for support and helping us put these things together. So I want to thank all of you guys, and thank everybody out there for suffering listening to me with my cold. So I know I sounded pretty rough probably at some point. So I apologize for the sniffling, but luckily Tom was able to help me out, and I didn't have to do the whole presentation. So again, thanks everybody for listening. The slides will be up on the HRE shortly, and a recording of the webinar will be up as well. So again, thank you, and have a good day.